Hello there. Welcome to another midweek meditation. I am Reverend Devin, and this is a weekly meditation that I do for my churches in Hyde Park, Bakersfield, and Jeffersonville, Vermont. This is also a meditation that I do for anybody who's joining in over YouTube and is looking to nurture a progressive faith. If you're looking for a second opinion on how we can build up a loving faith within our lives, I hope that you like and subscribe, and please feel free to share these videos with anybody you feel called to. Our reading comes from John chapter 11, verses 1 through 45. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, from the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard this, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then, after this, he said to his disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about Lazarus' death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. And so Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to him and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." But Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up and quickly went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a great stench because he has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. So, this reading from John chapter 11 is about the death of Lazarus. And this is a pretty common story that many people know of from the Bible. Jesus resurrecting Lazarus from the dead was a big deal, and a lot of people see this as a foreshadowing of Jesus being resurrected from the dead after he was put to death on the cross. However, I do think that there is a lot that one can unpack from a story like this, and I've preached on this passage so many times. I find myself often trying to focus on different elements of the passage in order to at least share something new with my congregations. And this week in particular, as I look at this passage, this story from John chapter 11, I'm thinking primarily about the importance of individual life and how each and every one of our lives are interconnected with each other. The death of Lazarus was a big deal for those who knew him, those who were connected to him in life. His death is particularly hard felt by his sister Mary and his other sister Martha. And I think that by having such a prominent figure die in this passage, it really does highlight just how destructive a loss of a loved one can be in our own lives. I think that many people often read through this passage and they think it's unfair that Jesus resurrects this person from the dead, because so many of us lose loved ones, but we don't get the ability to have them brought back to life, very rarely at least. And I recognize that. I recognize that it does speak to an element of unfairness that we see this miracle of resurrection happen for Lazarus, who happens to be, buddy with Jesus, and so he gets it's what seems like a special perk. But I also think that this passage does highlight just how tumultuous, just how much of a loss it can be when we lose an individual life within our own lives. Lazarus was the head of his household, and he, in a lot of ways, extended protections to his household. I think that Lazarus, in particular, highlights just how life-changing a death can be for other people. Mary and Martha in particular, Martha is weeping and blames Jesus, saying that if you had been here, my brother would not have died. I think that reaction feels harsh to somebody who is just picking up the book and reading through the story and probably doesn't understand the relationship that existed between Martha, Mary, Jesus, and Lazarus. I mean, Lazarus was a supporter of Jesus, and the fact that he had his sisters living in his household, unmarried, in a lot of ways shows that Lazarus had a pretty progressive outlook on things. He ran a pretty progressive house, and it stands to reason that he extended certain freedoms to his sisters that they probably would not have normally received in a male-dominated society, in a male-dominated world. Lazarus' death wouldn't have just been the end of his life, it would have been the end of his sisters' lives as they knew it. And it also probably would have affected many other people within his household, servants, tenants, friends who relied upon him, and people who were also relied upon his generosity. Lazarus was an important figure in his world, and I think that by highlighting the death of an important figure, it also makes us think a little bit about how important each and every one of our lives can be. Not just Lazarus, but also I think that if Mary were the one to die, there would have been an important vacuum that would have been created in her absence. And the same with Martha, who was the person who kept the household together. Each and every one of these people offered special gifts to their families, the people that they were connected to. And it is important. It is an important message that we find in this passage that shows just how destructive a death can be and just how hard felt it can be, because it's not just something that affects us emotionally. It can affect us socially. It can affect us financially. It can affect us in so many different ways. It can affect us physically as well. And so in restoring Lazarus to life, Jesus wasn't just healing a friend. He was healing an entire ecosystem that was connected in on his love. And I think that that is a very Christian message. The way in which we can lose those connections. I think that this passage shows just how important connections can be by showing an example of what happens when we lose them. The way in which we can lose somebody to death or to falling out of relationship with somebody, issues of maybe they've moved away, maybe you've had an argument, maybe there is resentment between two people. When you lose a loved one, a person that you rely upon or draw support from, that is in a lot of ways, as I think Paul would say, like losing a part of your own body. And I've seen this so many times as I try to help, for instance, people who have lost a spouse and have to readjust their lives because a lot of the skills that they relied upon, perhaps their spouse was the person that took care of the family budget, or who cleaned the house, or was responsible for organizing family dinners and got people together for the holidays. You know, people lose those certain skills that we take for granted because we've been relying upon others to, in a lot of ways, complete us. What happened in this passage with Lazarus' death was that an important element of an ecosystem of love that made it complete was lost. And sometimes we do lose those important elements in our lives. We don't always get them back like we do in this passage. But I do think an important thing that we do need to consider here is Christ tells us where there is death, there is rebirth. And even though Lazarus was brought back physically in this story, I do think rebirth takes on many different forms. It doesn't always take on the form of a person rising from the dead and coming back to life. It can take the form of somebody adjusting into a new role and taking on responsibilities and actions that somebody who came before did. It can take on the role of a institution, for instance, like the church. A lot of people worry that the church may die. Well, maybe the church as we know it will die. Maybe a lot of the churches that we take for granted on our corner streets here in Vermont will go under, and Christianity as we know it will get wiped from the state. I find that frightening, but it doesn't mean necessarily that Christianity will go away. The faith as a tradition could always pop back. It has happened before. And sometimes we need death in order to find new life. Sometimes, unfortunately, the old needs to pass away in order to make way for the new. And unfortunately, I've seen that happen in church as well, because churches very often struggle with change. And the way in which you traditionally see change in church is generations passing on and new generations taking over. But this is the message of rebirth that Jesus is telling us about, that we are connected to each other, and when we lose those connections, it can hurt. But that doesn't mean that we will lose our wholeness. That doesn't mean that we can't heal. That doesn't mean that we can't grow into something new and strong. And so we're closing up Lent, and we're entering into Holy Week. And I think that the message here is that we're going to find loss. The connections that we rely upon in this life will get disrupted by death or tragedy or just people parting ways. But even when we suffer a loss, there can be healing, and wholeness can come again. It comes through change. It comes through rebirth. But there is something blessed and sacred in that. And the teachings of Christ are meant to help us pick up those pieces when we are broken, so that we can be reborn and start again.